Okay, well, let's get started with the next panel. As you just heard from that fascinating conversation with General Hawk, China is top of the list of the perceived threats to the US right now. But one of the things that I notice as I go around with my Financial Times hat on and talk to investors and business leaders and policymakers around the world is that there is a profound sense of confusion, bafflement, uncertainty about what on earth is actually happening inside China. The country seems to be simultaneously transparent and also extremely opaque, not just in terms of its military intentions, but also its economy and the socioeconomic developments. So we're now going to have a panel discussion which is going to dive into what exactly is really happening inside China, with a group of people who are extremely well qualified to talk about that. And I'm going to start off by handing over to the moderator, Raymond Friedman, who's the Professor of Management at the Owen Graduate School of Management here at Vanderbilt University, who has been an expert on issues ranging from labor relations to negotiation, dispute resolution, the management of diversity, and cross-cultural differences between Chinese and American managers. I think that means he's an expert cross-cultural translator. So, over to you, Professor Friedman.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. I'd like to start by introducing four amazing speakers we have here for you today, and I'll give you a brief introduction to each. Dave Frederick is the Assistant Deputy Director for China National Security Agency. He sets agency-wide strategy for addressing the PRC, and before he was Executive Director of U.S. Cyber Command. Welcome. Mary Gallagher is Lowenstein Professor of Democracy and Human Rights at University of Michigan, expert in politics, law, and society in China, and author of many books including Contagious Capitalism, Globalization, and the Politics of Labor in China. Welcome. Andre Guinan, Assistant Professor of Political Science here at Vanderbilt, and a fellow, and he has been a nuclear security fellow at the Council of Foreign Relations and a fellow at the NATO Defense College. He studies international security, deterrence, and international alliances. Welcome. And lastly, Hannes Hanso, the Estonian ambassador to China. Previously, he served as Estonia's defense minister and was a member of the European Parliament and helped represent the EU in China and Mongolia. Welcome, everybody. So the goal of this panel is to get a set of basic understanding laid out for understanding a context, for understanding later discussions on more specific topics later in the conference. I have three buckets in mind that I'm going to go through. One is going to be internal, social, and economic situation in China. The second one is looking at China's economic and military relations external to China. And with the rest of the world. And third, the big issue that people talk about, Taiwan. So those are the three big buckets that I plan to cover. And I'd like to start looking internally at what we know and about the economy and society in China. And I'd like to start with Professor Gallagher and Ambassador Hanso to discuss this aspect of China. And Professor Gallagher, I'll start by asking you to update, with a current understanding of the economic situation in China. And it's thought to be challenging at best right now.
Thank you. Yeah, I'll try to, there's a number of different clocks, so I think there's no way I'll go over my allotted 5 minutes. I want to start by talking a bit about the current economic and social situation, but necessarily going back to the pre-COVID era and then what happened to China during zero COVID. And I think it's the combination of those two things that really matter in understanding what is happening in the Chinese economy today and what Xi Jinping is saying about the Chinese economy, because it's really important to listen to what he's saying about the economy. At the same time, I want to argue really strongly against the notion that this is peak China, which has been advanced in the media recently, which might be the case really from a purely GDP growth standpoint. It might be that these are the highest growth rates that China will see, the growth rates it saw 10 years ago, and that the Chinese economy may never in some way catch up to the United States. But I don't actually think that's the most important metric to think about right now. I think the Chinese Communist Party's ambitions for China are arguably intensified because of slowing growth, not reduced. China's growth has been slowing for the past decade. This was recognized as a necessity as China tried to wean itself off of growth in the mid-2008 around the global financial crisis, as it started to try to wean itself off of this reliance on government investment that it had relied upon once the crisis happened and exports started to decline in importance. Of course, more recently, heavily also dependent on the property sector. This reflects a long-standing desire to transition China's growth model away from this investment from the government and real estate towards what has been called high-quality growth, innovation in new centers, dual circulation, and to some degree towards domestic consumption. I see 2021 as a critical year in this progression of thinking about how China's economy will change, because it was that moment when Xi Jinping saw China as the most successful country in managing the pandemic, and he was quite confident about China's superiority, not just in controlling COVID, but also in this battle for new types of technologically driven growth. Looking around other countries around the world that were still struggling to operate, dealing with shortages, and dealing with the pandemic. In 2021, he launched his most ambitious programs and ideologies to address these long-term goals. He talked about common prosperity as a goal of reducing inequality, of shifting to domestic consumption, of expanding the welfare state, new types of taxation, crackdowns on what he called disorderly capital. This led to a lot of speculation that Xi Jinping was finally moving forward towards some significant structural reforms in the Chinese economy. But the way it was done, with these big announcements and big speeches and campaigns, unleashed also a lot of fear and a lot of loss of confidence in China's business community. This was then exacerbated by what happened afterwards, as zero COVID was extended well beyond its usefulness, leading to harsh and inhumane lockdowns across many Chinese cities, most especially Shanghai in the spring of 2022. These crackdowns broke the spirit of China's entrepreneurial classes, surprised urban elites that they could bear the brunt of the government's ruthlessness, and that their rights of movement could be so extremely curtailed. This led, of course, in November 22 to what was called the blank paper protest movement, in which protesters very quickly focused not on local governments, which is usually the case, not on local corruption, but on Xi Jinping himself and on calls for him to step down, which is something I have actually never seen happen in Chinese protests, at least that quickly. Now, the blank paper protest movement was very short-lived, and many people who participated were severely punished, but it did have the effect of getting rid of zero COVID once and for all. So the ambitions of 2021 were dashed. His moves to crack down on tech led to a rout for some of China's most successful companies like Alibaba. And Western economies, including the United States, began to recover and recover better than most expected. 2022 also revealed the government's shocking lack of preparation for an exit strategy from COVID and reiterated fears that Xi Jinping's information environment might be so severely damaged by his encirclement by yes men and underlings, so that he may not truly understand the extent of the economic crisis nor what would happen after zero COVID ended. So what does this tell us about Xi Jinping's leadership and his role in dictating the economy? I would argue it's really a pattern of failure. It's a part of a series of announcements and proclamations from 2013 that have not gone well or gone as expected. So he's made a lot of promises. He's done a lot of announcements as China's unparalleled leader, but he has yet to deliver. And I think what that means is that there's a crisis of confidence in China's governance model. And this, as you can see in things like the stock market or in the way in which the business community is reacting, as well as the continued desire of Chinese students to go to other countries like the United States for higher education. It's also why we see this current situation now where we see Xi Jinping focus so closely on the bright spots in the Chinese economy, hoping that these bright spots will change the narrative. So what's happened since then is that the third plenum was never held. This was the plenum expected at the end of 2023, announcing new changes to economic policies. So there's nothing new on the economy, or there's disagreement internally, or Xi Jinping is just simply not willing to talk about bad news. China's current pursuit now, which is to double down on new productive forces, what the new slogan is new productive forces. Previously it was made in China, previously it was innovation or high quality growth. And I think this is really interesting because it's very effective actually for scaring the bejesus out of people in the United States and Germany in particular around electric vehicles. But it actually does very little for addressing China's domestic problems, which are structural in nature. But this is also, I think, telling about Xi Jinping himself. He believes very strongly in the appearance of confidence in order to create confidence when it doesn't exist. So you see doubling down on these sectors, and so investment is actually not going down, it's just shifting from infrastructure and the property sector to manufacturing to create this, focus on things that are going very well, and also using that to mobilize competition with the West. And this is really smart. I mean, it actually instills nationalism and pride in China's population around the areas that China is doing well in. It may work to help to rebuild support for himself as the leader. So he's doing the right thing by advancing and promoting these industries that are now being threatened by the West through tariffs, of course, from the United States, an investigation in the EU on Chinese subsidies. The problem for Xi, of course, is that these sectors are not significantly big to address the deeper structural issues of the Chinese economies. So to conclude, I want to say this is also a problem for the West. These policies of exclusion that the West has currently taken with China's new industries could reinforce his power, unite the private sector and citizens with him, when in fact there is a real opportunity to divide them by being more open strategically to Chinese investment at a time when the environment at home in China is not good, either politically or economically. Of course, this poses some risks, and these risks are talked about a lot in the US media and among US politicians, risks of communist infiltration or risks of the theft of intellectual property. But I think this is a risk worth taking as a way to preserve the US's reputation as a haven for smart, hardworking, entrepreneurial people from China or from any other place around the world. Thank you. And I'm sorry, I did actually go too long.
Well, thank you. That was great. Hannes, I'd like to ask you to, you've lived in China for a long time. You're on the ground there. What do you see going on in social issues in China? We talked about some of them on the phone earlier. What are the key things that we all need to be aware of?
Thank you. The first time I went to China was in 1994. And since then, once a decade at least, I have had a period, several years or more, that I've spent in China. So I've seen this country developing over the sort of 30-year period. There's enormous challenges that are faced, the Chinese government, the Chinese nation is facing at the moment. The period of the sort of rapid growth that we all grew used to is gone. Also the period when foreigners were, as investors, as people, were welcome to China is gone. Just as a side remark, I always like to go out in Beijing in the evening if I have a chance. And what I find these days very often is you go and sit down in some nice corner restaurant and local people are having the food and drink and maybe more drink, and at some point they will want to come across and, where are you from? I say, I'm from Estonia. Okay, you're not from the US, come and join us for drinks. That's really happens as a pattern. Yeah, they first check you if you're an American. If not, then cool. So this is a new thing. This is a new thing in China. So the legitimacy that was formed, I think, for the CCP and different presidents or prime ministers of China is slowly giving way to skepticism, because people really see very little prospect. And many are voting with their feet. Our embassy is literally 50 meters across from the US visa section. And I see these young people, Chinese people, in their thousands. It takes about 6 months to get a number to be in that queue to apply for a visa. About 300,000, I think, come to study here in a year. Another 150,000 will go to Australia, 100,000 to the UK and Canada and so many other places. So there is a skepticism. Foreign investors are skeptical, leaving the country, moving out, many to Vietnam, many to other Southeast Asian destinations. But you asked about the social problems. What I see, youth unemployment, it's very high. In June 2023, the Chinese government, when the numbers reached 21%, that's officially, and it's important to emphasize officially, 21%, then the Chinese government simply stopped producing the statistics. So they recalculated the formula, so now it's again 14%. But in fact, of course, everybody knows that in rural areas it's about 40%. And if you consider underemployment or part-time employment, it's 50%. Recently, I took my family out to Yunnan province in southern China, and I saw these people from Guangdong province working in a hotel, volunteering, they told me. I said, why? Because they're from Shenzhen, you know, the industrial IT hub of China. They're from Shenzhen, but they're volunteering because they get food and they get free board. They're there because there's no work. These are things that you see in your everyday life when you talk to people in China. So about 1 in 5 of 100 million Chinese, 100 million Chinese between the ages of 16 and 24 were unemployed, like last summer. You see Guaidis, these couriers, they wear blue or yellow or green in Beijing and all the other cities in China, the couriers. You know, many of them are highly educated young people, but they have simply nothing else to do. So that's one problem, youth unemployment and very few prospects to enter a labor market. Previous speaker already mentioned property crisis, but the seriousness or the scale of this is just absolutely staggering. About 80 million properties have been built in China. They are half built or built, but they stay vacant. You could sleep 400 million people in those, more than the entire population of the United States. So those large companies, some of them have become very prominent, and I think you have heard of those too. Country Garden, Evergrande Group, I mean, they go like 300 billion US in debt before they go bankrupt. Many of them have ratings, you know, junk ratings now, those companies. Because the Chinese, they're people who have by far the highest savings income ratio in the world. And where do people say invest traditionally? There's no sort of social system like we are used to in many Western countries, at least in Europe, pension system. So people used to invest, and they invested in property. So 70% of the family investments are tied up in property. And when I take a train inside China, you see you go past these ghost towns between Shanghai or Beijing or any other big city. I mean, it's just huge sky rises have been put up on simply the fields. There's no windows, structures are there, empty shells, no cars, no people, nothing. So this has gone wrong on a colossal scale. I mean, as I said, our embassy and the US embassy are neighbors in Beijing, and you know, I often go for a run, and within about 1 kilometer, if you know where to look, you'll see those huge houses, simply no lights on at night. They're empty, no one there. And local governments, they have now reached this financial crisis too, because they used to depend on selling land to developers. It seemed to be everlasting, you know, you could just infinitely do it. Now, no more money is coming in. COVID, the local governments really, municipalities spent huge amounts of money trying to enforce this zero COVID. There's no money coming in. So there are huge structural problems within the Chinese financial system now. Richer provinces are asked to compensate or subsidize the poorer ones. Especially in the north, there are huge difficulties. So, they turn off streetlights at night because there's no money. So that's another difficult issue. And of course, population decrease. Everybody knows about one China policy. This was lifted more than 10 years ago. Two children were allowed, then now 3. But the Chinese people are not having children. As simple as that. 2022, the population decreased by 850,000 people. Doesn't look much, a country of 1.4 billion, but it will grow exponentially. So 2.06 million, and that's again official statistics. Some say that the real numbers are much worse. So it will continue growing by the turn of the century, and that's by Shanghai Social Sciences Academy. China could have a population of 575 million people only. There are different statistics. So population is aging. Average age is reaching almost 80 years soon. So how many working people will you have per retiree? So quite some serious problems there that you see when you live on the ground in China and when you speak to the people. They don't see, the future being too bright. When you listen to the government, of course, it's all fantastic. Ambassadors are invited to National People's Congress opening ceremony. So one just took place at the end of March. I attended the opening ceremony, and this is quite some sight. The Prime Minister is speaking, and there are 3,500 people, delegates. They all turn. It's a written text. Everybody has a copy. So they all turn the page at the same time. 3,500 people turning the page at the same time. It's deafening, the sound that it makes in this huge hall. And you hear those, those speeches from the Prime Minister, everything is good. So, but there is a gap between, I think, what people see on the ground and what you hear at these sort of events that I just mentioned.
Thank you very much. Those are amazing insights from on the ground in China. I'd like to switch direction to look outside of China. And with that, I want to switch to David and talk about what he sees as the main kind of category of threats we have coming from China as they reach around the world, economically, militarily.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, so, I'm still kind of shocked at the ambassador, some of the points you made, so I have to collect my thoughts here. But thank you for sharing that. It really kind of sobering. When I look at kind of global reach for the PRC and what they're doing to kind of extend their influence and power, I'll focus initially on kind of the military aspect of that, but I do want to touch on the informational and kind of economic forms of power in a moment as well. But when you look at extended reach and kind of look out beyond, the cross-straits focus that the PLA has, I'll talk about kind of at the global level and at the regional level. So at the global level, the longest arm of the People's Liberation Army is definitely in cyberspace. And General Hawk talked about that extensively in his remarks, so I won't kind of belabor that and repeat too much, but can't kind of overstate the seriousness of what they're doing in terms of pre-positioning, attack capability, and critical infrastructure, and how different it is from how responsible Western military forces would operate, right? And they're really moving to establish a capability to conduct real indiscriminate attacks to sow chaos and disorder. So that's really concerning. Kind of moving out of the cyberspace discussion for a moment, we look at the investments they're making in both their outer space, their counter space capabilities, missiles, and nuclear is also an area there where they can kind of reach out and affect the United States directly. And so China's investing significantly in their space capabilities and in their counter space capabilities, and they've deployed a whole range of attack platforms, everything from direct ascent missiles to co-orbital satellites that can attack U.S. satellites to electronic warfare and directed energy weapons. And so That's an important aspect that we're looking at in the Department of Defense from a national security standpoint. And with that, they've established partnerships in other regions to enable them to operate their space capabilities. And so they've got support bases now located in Pakistan, Argentina, Namibia, and Kenya that are critical to their overall space capability. So you're really seeing this growth, in terms of an expansion of their focus well beyond their local region. And then in another area, I think, is their regional posture. And China is slowly building out their regional basing and logistics infrastructure. And so they've normalized kind of their participation in military presence through their operations they're doing in the Gulf of Aden in terms of anti-piracy patrols, and certainly they're very active in UN peacekeeping. So their military is getting some exposure and developing partnerships around the world in that context. Of course, their base in Djibouti is very well known. And in 2022, the PLA affirmed that they will have some access to Cambodia's Ream naval base as well, which is an area that they've invested, that China's invested heavily in Cambodia. So that's something we're watching, and the U.S. assessment is that they'll continue to most likely continue to look for additional places to grow military logistics and basing infrastructure, and if successful, that will start to put some constraints and risks for U.S. military operations. Right, it'll definitely create a complicating factor there. So that's an area. Those are kind of the key areas we're looking at, kind of at the global and regional scale in terms of the PLA. We'll note that the foundation of national security power really is in the economic and ideological front, and I think in that space the PRC they've seen mixed results, and I think our other speakers have already hit on that. But they certainly are trying to offer a completely different model of ideological and informational model to the world, and especially pushing that in the global South. But really kind of mixed success in that space. A 2022 Pew Research survey of global respondents indicated only 18% believe that Xi Jinping would do the right thing in terms of world affairs. So not a great look in that context. And then on the economic space, certainly Belt and Road Initiative ran into some headwinds, and post-COVID they've launched the Global Development Initiative to try to kind of reboot those efforts. But that economic power, where they're successful, will kind of open up additional doors for them. But what we've seen is countries are starting to become very concerned about economic coercion, and there's so many examples of that, ranging from the efforts they did against Australia around questions about the origins of COVID. To kind of economic punishment on Lithuania, Norway, and others, South Korea and others. And so I do think nations are starting to wrestle with that reality, and when they look at their economic partnerships with the PRC.
Thanks, Dave. Thank you very much. I'd like to ask Professor Gannon, Andre, what are the possibilities for the West to respond, and what are things that restrict or might influence the U.S., Europe, EU, their ability to respond to the potential threats that are emerging from China?
So I think there's two elements that I'd like to discuss. There's the political one and then the sort of military dimension. On the political dimension, the upcoming election in the United States is an incredibly important one, and I can confidently say that every April for the rest of my life. But I think the point sort of largely stands for this one in the context of China. In a poll that was conducted last month in the United States, they asked respondents, what is the biggest threat to the United States? 41% of respondents said China. 24% said Russia, which is really interesting given what we have in the conventional sort of news headlines. What I find more interesting was what happens when we break this out by party affiliation, where for Republicans, 67% of them said China, and only 10% said Russia. And for Democratic respondents, it was something like 42% that said Russia, and only 20% of them said China. 5% of independents said the United States itself, which I'll leave as a future commentary. But I think what this really points to is it tells us something about what the upcoming election and who wins that election in both Congress and the presidency will say about what U.S. priorities are in the world. I think this both has to do with the geographic dimensions of it. Is China where we're putting our resources, or are we still trying and failing to pivot away from the Middle East? How much will things that happen with Russia and Ukraine continue? Is there a way out? And the elections will change the way that the United States is able to allocate those resources differently across its departments. And so I think that that's something that has a big dimension. I think there's also a big difference that upcoming election will have in terms of just how far does U.S. national interest extend? And I think this is a really, really foundational question that underlies most of the conclusions that we come to as policymakers or practitioners or academic researchers, but I don't think we think about it enough. Why is it that events that are happening regarding China and Taiwan matter to Americans, however that is defined? What about issues in the Middle East, about issues with Russia and Ukraine, about supply chains? And there's different ways of saying that these things are or are not salient to the U.S. national interest, but that's something that the decisions that are made from those assumptions are ones that are going to matter greatly in terms of what happens in the upcoming election and so forth. On the security dimension, over the past 25 or 30 years, what was hyped a lot was that we've entered the missile era. We had, the use of or the development of nuclear weapons during the Cold War, the ability to target any spot that existed on the world. From the Gulf War onwards, we saw this actually happening in a conventional sense, where we saw wars being fought where the bloodshed by the person that is doing the attacking is very, very low. We're just lobbing very heavy pieces of metal at one another. And the idea has been that that's how we're going to see warfare being fought. We had discussions earlier today about how we're seeing that with the use of drones. What I think is really interesting that some people have sort of talked about in the past week, and it's too soon to tell, but this missile era is now maybe being transformed into a missile defense era, where we no longer have the idea that the Earth is flat and that everywhere can be targeted. What was seen as a pie-in-the-sky idea about shooting a bullet with a bullet 15 or 20 years ago, turns out that we're pretty good at it. And I think we're a lot better than we thought. I think that this dramatically changes the degree to which countries think that defending Taiwan or defending Ukraine or getting involved in the Middle East means physically being in the region versus the degree to which it means you can just sort of step back and lob things from far away. And I think that this was a large part of why the United States was sort of beefing up its relationship with Australia. Part of the AUKUS agreement was there's a Goldilocks effect there geographically. They're not as close as Japan and South Korea and being in the fire zone of potential missiles and being vulnerable, but they're not so far away that it becomes expensive and difficult to do. And I think that's a calculation that we see is changing. And so I think that when I've seen wargaming exercises that I've participated in for what would be the role of the United States military and other security apparatuses in conflict with China, it's really hard to tell now. What areas of the world are relevant for the United States military? Can this be fought from 2,000 miles away? Or what does sort of invasion of crossing the strait actually mean for the role that other actors play? And so I think that that's different now than it was 10 years ago, maybe even different now than it was 2 weeks ago. And so I think that replanning how we think about the role of geography and a military sense is continuing to evolve, not even to mention the cyber sense of bits and bytes can travel pretty quickly, but does it matter if they're trying to go 4,000 miles as opposed to just down the street? And so I think that these are the types of considerations that policymakers should be considering.
Well, thank you. That brings us right to Taiwan, the next bucket I wanted to focus on. And just to level set, I just make a quick set of comments on kind of the history and how we got here. Historically, Taiwan was controlled by Dutch, Chinese, Japanese in different points in time. 1949, of course, Nationalist Party retreats to Taiwan after losing to the Chinese Communist Party, initially claiming to rule all of China and maintaining martial law. It finally moved to a democracy in 1996, the first presidential elections in Taiwan, and they gave up the pretense of having controlling and ruling all of China. But there still was a one-child policy that everyone kind of cooperatively agreed to as a way to have a fiction that would just keep things calm, and no one was much worrying about resolving it very quickly. But Xi Jinping has been pushing for a much more immediate resolution, and things have become much more tense. In the meantime, Taiwanese, very, very few now have a sense of Chinese identity in the way they would have had 40, 50 years ago. and very few, maybe 5%, actually want to be ruled by Beijing. So going in very, very different directions. The foundational question I think to ask is, why should we care about Taiwan? There's a lot at stake, a lot of tactical questions, a lot of concerns. But what is it that drives the concern with Taiwan? I can see questions about morality and freedom, democracy, philosophy, geopolitical ones, alliances and credibility. I can see economic ones, shipping lanes and chips. But I'd like to start with Hannes, talking about the perspective from the Baltics. So you have a unique history with some strong reaching out to Taiwan and a special relationship maybe with Taiwan. What is it for you that makes Taiwan so important?
I think the main concern, or one of the sort of the biggest concerns from the Beijing point of view, is that when we look at the region in a little bit of a historic perspective, Japan started as a very authoritarian state, gradually with the economy developing, shifted into democratic society. The same thing, again, through a very heavy authoritarian phase. South Korea, with economy developing, it became a competitive democratic country, and so did Taiwan. So I think it's probably, in a way, like existential issue for the authoritarian China now, because it's a role model, I think, vibrant role model for many Chinese, to look at. And I think even the repressions that we have seen in Hong Kong may explain, why China is so sensitive about showing mainlanders that the Chinese people can live in freedom and democracy. So we, after 50 years plus of Soviet occupation, of course, feel very strongly, emotionally, about these sort of nations, these sort of people. We know what it means ourselves. Yeah. So traditionally, I mean, I've been a member of parliament. We have not had a parliament, I don't think, where there's been no friendship group for Taiwan. There is one now also. Now, as a civil servant, as a government representative in China, of course, it's one of the issues that I'm often called to MFA to explain. Again, our members of parliament like to go to Taiwan, chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee, and what's particularly irritating for the Chinese is that 3 Baltic states often do these things together. So also the Taiwanese foreign minister, Joseph Wu, was in Tallinn and Riga and in Vilnius last year. So it's one of the irritants that is between our countries, but our people simply feel very strong sympathy to the types of situations such as Taiwan. And of course, the Chinese, they will not understand and not appreciate. Lithuania, as you know, was actually expelled in diplomatic terms from China. There is no Lithuanian. The European Union, we have monthly ambassadors meetings, heads of missions meetings, so there's one country missing for several years now. Because Lithuanians allowed Taiwan to open an office in Vilnius, the capital of Lithuania, under the name of Taiwan. And the Chinese reacted really crudely by expelling Lithuanian diplomats. So the issue has not been resolved, even though there have been some attempts to do so, negotiate some sort of a way out. But I think for the Chinese, it seems to be the red line. As you know, international recognition of Taiwan is decreasing. One or 2 countries, I think, this year or last year again, have switched the recognition to the People's Republic. So I think China feels super sensitive about that. Trend might be reversed somewhere else, for example, in Europe. But yeah, I think Taiwan. We do not support any sort of kinetic resolution to this issue, even though geographically Taiwan is very far from us. Economically, we are not dependent in any way, but there is an understanding, I think, that is very prevalent.
Yeah. So it's a very personal, emotional kind of connection with the democracy and freedom of a small country facing...
Particularly because of our own background.
Yeah. So I'd like to turn to Dave and ask, in practical terms, in terms of economics, in terms of military, what would make you say we should care about what happens to Taiwan?
Okay, yeah. I would highlight a couple of points, and I definitely think the moral element of it is also at play here. But if you look at the arc of U.S. foreign policy, we tend to oscillate over time between values-based and realpolitik, and so I won't make any predictions on where we'll be on the wave at any particular time. But if you look at it from a values point of view, certainly you're talking about a vibrant democracy, and I think at times, in times of crisis, the U.S. population does kind of recall our role as a beacon on a hill, and so I would be hopeful as a private citizen that would be the case when the time came. Our policy is obviously purposely ambiguous, which I think adds some value. I will point to the last time we were in ground combat with China in the origins of the Korean War, where the U.S. drew what was called the Akasan line, that carved out and basically highlighted the peninsula of Korea as outside U.S. interests. Which then emboldened the North Korean invasion with support from Mao Zedong and Stalin. And so I think those red lines aren't always really helpful, and so understand the ambiguity aspect of it. If you flip it around and look at the realpolitik piece, from an economic point of view, we're very focused, I think, on the economic and kind of technology security nexus. And there's a pretty frequently used statement that semiconductors are kind of the new oil, and Taiwan, TSMC, major producer of semiconductors for the planet, and so does the United States want to have that much reliance? If there was a unification between Taiwan and PRC, particularly one that's forced upon the Taiwanese. Do we want to, have a situation where we are now almost fully dependent on the PRC for semiconductors and advanced technologies? Certainly, there's moves afoot through industrial policy steps to try to correct that, but that's not going to be a short-term process to turn around. It certainly has some challenges ahead. I think from a military point of view, the question really gets to how would we expect China to conduct an operation, and how would they approach it? And I'll just turn to what they've written themselves. So if you look at PLA writings and their military strategies, they've been operating off, to begin with, a doctrine called the Three Warfares Doctrine that's about 20 years old now, that starts with the idea of really kind of winning combat, winning the war without any combat. It focuses on shaping public opinion, on lawfare, and psychological operations. And so I think the first step in what they're doing every day, and there's an ongoing contest every day in this already, is the efforts that they're doing to run a range of influence operations, everything from covert to overt, to influence public opinion, both in Taiwan and the United States, but really in the global South and abroad. They couple that with creating national security legal mechanisms that tries to change, give them an advantage, and then finally do think that they would use psychological operations as part of a broader operation. So that's, I think, a basis for that. They are definitely watching the lessons learned, getting lessons learned from the Russian invasion of Ukraine and all the troubles the Russians are facing, and how effective Ukraine has been in defending their territory, and happy to talk about that if time allows. But that's an interesting element that China's definitely watching that and trying to adjust to that. But they clearly have described in their doctrine and strategy intentions to have various options available for their leadership. Everything from a coercive model, where they just try to coerce Taiwan to comply, to a blockade option, kind of an air and maritime blockade coupled with I/O and information operations campaign, to what would be a really, really challenging military problem for them, an amphibious landing, right? So a joint island, what they call a joint island landing campaign. Very difficult military problem for them to pull off. But I think history's got many examples of governments deciding to pursue a policy that may not even be in their best self-interest, and certainly cases where military victory isn't guaranteed. Could point to many examples of that. So, thanks for the question.
All right, thank you. So, Mary, I'd like to turn to you for a moment and think about, do you sense any dynamics politically internal to China that make it more likely or less likely that they might be more aggressive to force the issue militarily?
Well, I agree definitely with Dave that the Ukraine war has probably made at least the Chinese military and the Chinese leadership much less enthusiastic, given the problems and the drawn-out nature of the war. I think there's a lot of evidence that at the beginning, China, in some ways, gave Putin a pass because they believed it would end really quickly, and it obviously hasn't. The thing I worry most about domestically within China is nationalism, which Xi Jinping has ginned up quite a lot, very substantially. And as well as the elite struggle. I do worry as we go on into Xi Jinping's now third term. Of course, he removed term limits from his presidency in 2018. That doesn't eliminate the problem of succession and who takes over after him. And even though he's surrounded himself by people who are very closely allied with him, as he gets into his, the fourth and probably fifth term, I just can't imagine that we won't see some really significant elite struggle. It wasn't that the problem had been solved previously under other administrations, but there had been, kind of a weekly institutionalized norm that there would be 2 terms and then there would be an administrative change. So all of those things being off the table now, it's very hard to predict when he will leave office, how he will leave office, and who the successor will be and how that successor will be chosen. So I just think that makes things unpredictable, and Taiwan is an issue that could be used in a domestic elite struggle. The 2 things more externally that I want to just point out is that, the bedrock of Taiwan policy abroad has been strategic ambiguity on the part of the US government and a desire for the status quo within Taiwan and probably also within the United States. Strategic ambiguity seems to be at risk in the sense that because of these dynamics and of heightened geopolitical competition with China, most presidents recently have shown, I think, a significant shift away from strategic ambiguity. I think President Biden has done this, I believe, 4 times in his presidency, so it's not just a flub. It's probably not just him speaking off the cuff. It seems to be a significant shift. I'm less confident that if Trump is elected in the fall, that he will be as clearly on the side of defending Taiwan that Biden has been, and I think that's an issue. I also worry about U.S. public opinion in regards if Trump is president, and we've seen that also with the debate about continuing to aid Ukraine, particularly within the Republican Party. The other thing that I just want to point out about status quo, which is the Taiwan thing, is that the status quo is not static. I mean, it feels static in the sense that there's no change in the status of Taiwan. But from the PRC's perspective, Taiwan is changing quite rapidly, right, in terms of Taiwan identity, in terms of how the government talks about Taiwan, in terms of, as opposed to Republic of China, the use of passports and changes on the passport to signal a heightened separate identity. So we talk about the status quo as being something that would bring stability, but to the PRC's perspective, this is not something that is static. It's changing quite rapidly. Thanks.
Thank you. So, Andre, I'd like to turn to you because we started getting into issues of how the U.S. would respond, their stance, and we have all the parties, U.S., China, Taiwan, trying to make calculations, and a lot of your work is on deterrence and how people think the other person is going to act, and watching the behavior and interests of other side. So there's a complex mesh of people interpreting signals. What are the signals that either have been sent out or need to be sent out to avoid war, or is that possible?
I hope it's possible. I think it's possible. The conventional wisdom used to be that conflicts were won by the side with more capabilities. During the nuclear era, that shifted to the idea that conflicts were won by the side with higher resolve, who cared more about the issue. And to tie back to the points that David was making about Russia and Ukraine, what we're seeing there, and what I think China is watching there, is what happens when those two things clash. One of the issues that has made the Russia-Ukraine conflict so challenging and hard to resolve is Russia thought, we have much higher capabilities, this means that we should win. And Ukraine thought, this is existential for us, our resolve is a lot higher, that means that we should win. And those two things were both genuine beliefs that each side held that clashed in a way that now we don't know what to do. And so I think that that's one of the things that China is looking at there, because there's a parallel in the Taiwan situation, where China has much more capabilities, and for Taiwan, they might believe that this is existential. And so I think one of the things that all actors are looking at rightfully in that situation is how those two things, capabilities and resolve, might change. Are there things that China can do to convey, this is existential for us as well? And those are the discussions we see about this being a core issue of national identity, what it means to be China as a nation state, and things like that. And on the flip side, there's things that Taiwan is doing to say, we have more capabilities than you think because we have some friends. And that gets to the discussion that Mary was having about the role of the United States and strategic ambiguity and things like that. And so I think that as China and Taiwan and the United States continue to realize that there's more information that we should be providing about this conflict in ways that'll either make sure that it doesn't break out, or that if it does break out, it goes in our favor, is manipulating the beliefs about the capabilities and resolve that they themselves have and what they believe about that of the other side.
Well, and then for Taiwan, China, it's as much Taiwan's friend, U.S., their resolve and
Exactly.
perceptions of that.
Yes.
And so that's where the elections come in, who is in charge of the government, and what public opinion is. I've heard many discussions over, would we go in and fight for Taiwan? And it would seem to the degree that the answer is no, then China would say, well,
Right.
that influences our actions.
Yeah, and I think that gets a bit just really quick to the technology element that you mentioned. Does China believe that the United States would spend X billion dollars in heavy pieces of metal to lob over the Taiwan Strait? Maybe some amount. How many body bags is the United States willing to risk returning back to the continental United States to defend Taiwan? That's a very open question. That depends on the election. That depends on what the United States can credibly signal. That depends on what China believes. And I think that these things matter a lot.
Yeah, Hannes?
Just a brief comment. I think the Russia-Ukraine war is an important example here. China clearly is looking, but it's not only about Ukraine, Russia on a battlefield. It's also about the international reaction that followed Russia's aggression against Ukraine. I think it was unexpected for Russia. They really did not believe such a strong reaction. Sanctions, cutting of energy supplies, weapons deliveries, all across the board assistance. I think China is a trading nation. Its economy is completely dependent on exports. So if we can convince People's Republic that its main trading partners, that will be Western countries, the European Union, North America, Australia, New Zealand, would take the similar strong position, I think it would deter China.
Yeah. And thinking about domestic opinion and the idea of strategic ambiguity. I've seen debates about whether strategic ambiguity is good to maintain, avoid the red lines, or if in terms of signaling that makes it fuzzy and makes it less clear. Is strategic ambiguity something that is time to go, really central? How would we think about that?
I've kind of already, I think, said my piece on it, but I do agree with Andres on the point that the stakes are incredibly high, and it's been a long time since the United States fought a war that resulted in high numbers of casualties in a very short amount of time, a long time. And Vietnam certainly certainly we lost souls in Afghanistan and Iraq, but those are spread out over a long period of time, and the numbers of that in those periods, I mean, wouldn't come close to what we would probably see if we got in a full-scale conflict with the PLA. And so I think you really have to go back in terms of compressed loss of life to the Korean War. So I do think that plays into a role of question about U.S. resolve on this. But the Atkinson line example I gave was one of lack of ambiguity. The adversary was convinced that we would not, intervene, and we certainly did. So, I think it's my view. And I'm an intelligence officer, not a policymaker, and I'm glad I'm not a policymaker. It's actually a really hard job, but I can understand the benefit of that. But
well, we started off talking about the
Yeah.
domestic weakness economically, socially inside of China, and you can imagine that cutting, two ways. Either saying, in times of desperation, find an enemy outside, or, they need to take care of, housing, jobs, and other things, and wouldn't risk disrupting the economy further. Given the current stresses on the economy in China, does that enhance or diminish the risks we see?
I don't think so. I guess I don't see, at least the way that Xi Jinping has been talking about the economy. This is not so much about what he would be willing to risk for war with Taiwan, but just in terms of what he's been saying about the economy recently and what the government and the party have been doing about the economy in the last year is they've done actually very little to revive, to get growth rates higher, to boost consumption, to do more to make the taxation system less regressive, to do more redistribution, to build up the social safety net. All very, very important things, not for, not even really for things like equality, but rather to put the Chinese economy on a surer footing, particularly as it's aging really quite rapidly. But they haven't done those things. He has now come out after this announcement of common prosperity that he actually believes that the welfare state makes people lazy, right? That's not the direction that China's going in. So, I think the reason why you see this focus on what he calls new productive forces, which is really about these sectors where China is doing well, it's solar and semiconductors and electric vehicles, that he's very old-fashioned in terms of how he thinks about the economy. It's really this kind of manufacturing base. It's keeping people employed in the real economy, and it's not about doing much to put it on a different track. And that makes me then, this is to answer the question about Taiwan, this makes me feel that he'd be willing to risk quite a lot if it came to conflict with the United States over Taiwan. And just as a related aside about the importance of Taiwan and U.S. showing resolve, one thing that we haven't mentioned, of course, is that, and this may be why strategic ambiguity is also, I think, less useful, is that it's signaling a lot to other allies in the region, right? It's signaling a lot to Japan, a lot to South Korea, and increasingly a lot to the Philippines, which is another point of big contention. Of course, Biden last week meeting with both and the Philippines.
So it's not just about Taiwan, it's about a whole range of allies.
I can briefly add, one thing that we haven't seen slow down is the pace of their military modernization. And so despite the economic headwinds, the PRC is executing a major modernization effort. They're starting construction of their fourth amphibious assault ship. Gives us some example of the options they're looking at. And they remain focused on a 2027 capabilities goal that Xi kind of reaffirmed at the 20th Party Congress to have a viable, kind of credible military option to force unification by 2027. It's pretty ambitious goal, so won't make your predictions on whether they hit it or not. But we've been noting that you don't see a slowdown on that, or a major effort to bring in AI, big data, and innovation to change the nature of warfare in their forces.
All right, I have to end in the last minute with the big question: TikTok, thumbs up or thumbs down? What do we think about the risks present or not present in TikTok?
I don't know about TikTok that much, but just an anecdote. So, China is very concerned about TikTok being discussed here in the United States and being seen as a security threat and all this. And the MFA in China tweets about it when this discussion going. They banned Twitter in 2012. So they banned US site Twitter on 2012. The MFA still uses it, and then they complain about TikTok being persecuted here in the US. Isn't that a paradox?
That's very much a paradox. Well, yeah,
just about TikTok, I think the important thing about TikTok is the latent ability of TikTok to be used. I don't think it has been used in that regard yet. But the way in which the Chinese government and the party use social media, particularly in the global south, is a really important thing to pay attention to. My son, who is on TikTok, watched the congressional testimony of the CEO, and he said, that guy looked like he said the Congress looked like such jerks asking him questions. And I said, where did you watch the videos? And he said, on TikTok. So.
Okay. Well, thank you very much to Hannes, Andre, Mary, and Dave. Thank you very much for your insights. Great to have you here. All right, thank you very much.